Kenichi is your average Japanese salaryman, and one day, while overworking himself as usual, he collapses to the floor. Normally, this would be where he gets sent to another world, but in Kenichi's case, he just survives and sues his company so he can retire on a farm. Life has been going pretty well for him, but all of a sudden, while he's making lunch for himself, he vanishes and appears in the middle of the forest. He tries looking around to figure out where he is, but all he finds is the skeleton of a fallen knight and a bunch of unfamiliar plants. He has watched a lot of anime in his lifetime, so he knows this is probably an isekai adventure. To confirm it, he yells out "status window" to see if something happens. To his surprise, a status screen does indeed appear, so he is definitely stuck in another world, and honestly, he's fine with that. He checks out his status, but he's a bit confused since he can't see any HP bar on the screen. However, he does have his Amazon account, so he can still make as many impulsive purchases as he wants. He also has access to an item box, so he picks up a handful of weeds to test out what the item box can do. He puts the weeds in his item box and figures out that he can separate and retrieve the individual components from the items he puts in it. He also decides to test out the store, so he takes a look at it, but unfortunately, he still needs money to buy things. There's a prompt that says he's allowed to trade items in his item box for money, but right now, all he's got is a couple of weeds, and those aren't worth much. He has literally nothing valuable to trade for money, so at this rate, he's probably going to starve. But just then, he notices the shiny equipment on the dead knight, and since he's dead anyway, it's not like he needs it anymore. And the first thing Kenichi does is buy some daily necessities and some bread from the store. Afterwards, he buries the knight's skeleton to pay his respects and leaves the area on the new bicycle he bought. He's searching for some kind of settlement so he can talk to some people and earn some money, but he has no idea where he is. For now, he decides to just set up camp for the night since he's not going to find anything today. However, if he doesn't find a city, he plans to resell some of the things he buys from the store to gain a massive profit. If he does that, he should be able to survive and thrive in this world. But there's just one problem. Until now, Kenichi hadn't considered that it would be dangerous out in the middle of the woods. Once night falls, he gets surrounded by a pack of wolves, and they don't look like they are friendly. Kenichi freaks out because he knows he's dead meat if he doesn't act fast, so he turns to his store and immediately tries to purchase the biggest gun he can find. Unfortunately, guns aren't available, so he settles for the next best thing and buys a bunch of fireworks. The fireworks scare the wolves a little, but it's ultimately not enough to get rid of them. Kenichi starts looking for something else. He eventually finds a slingshot and uses it to fire balls at the wolves. The force from the balls is so strong that it knocks a couple of the wolves out and makes the rest reconsider their options, since Kenichi clearly isn't as easy a target as they thought. Once the wolves back off, Kenichi immediately rushes over to his bike and rides into the night to get as far away from wolf territory as possible. By the next morning, Kenichi is exhausted from all the biking he did, but he's still got no idea where he is. He buys a ladder and a telescope so he can climb up one of the trees and look at his surroundings. Thankfully, he manages to spot a city over in the distance, so he should be able to start earning money if he heads over there. He begins the long journey through the grasslands, but as he finally makes it to the main road, he nearly ends up getting run over in the process. The guy in the cart apologizes for nearly hitting him, and since he feels bad about it, he offers to give Kenichi a ride to the city. He introduces himself as Fuyo, a merchant, and the woman in the back of his carriage is traveling Bard, so she's a fellow passenger. While they ride, Fuyu mentions how Kenichi is dressed pretty strangely, so he asks him what he's heading to the city for, and Kenichi responds, saying he plans to open a business there. Eventually, they make it through the city gates, so Fuyu drops Kenichi off in front of his store and Kenichi helps him unload his cargo. Fuyu thanks Kenichi for his help, but Kenichi is the one who should be thankful here since really helped him out. To show his gratitude, he gives Fuyu a pouch of pepper, but once Fuyu realizes what this is, he warns Kenichi not to sell it in this city. There's a spice mafia called Bacopa, and they have a total monopoly on the spice market, so if Kenichi tries to compete with them, they might send the Boeing assassin after him. Kenichi hadn't realized that simply selling his goods could be so dangerous, so he is thankful for Fuyu's warnings. Fuyu normally wouldn't want to risk drawing the attention of Bacopa, but since it's a private deal between him and Kenichi, he decides to buy the pepper. Kenichi tries to tell him he doesn't have to pay for it, but Fuyu insists since a merchant never accepts anything for free because that would mean he owes Kenichi a favor. Kenichi can understand that, so he accepts Fuyu's payment, but even though he was giving Fuyu a discount, he still got a lot more than he was expecting. He only paid 1,000 yen for that pepper, but Fuyu paid him the equivalent of 100,000 yen for it. Kenichi walks around town for a bit, and he eventually finds a local inn and restaurant, so he heads in and is greeted by the hostess Azalea. He tells her he is here for lodging, and she would be happy to help with that, so she shows him to the front desk. The price for one room is 1 copper coin and payment has to be made up front, so Kenichi gives her the money. Now all she needs Kenichi to do is write his name in the contract, but Kenichi suddenly realizes that he doesn't know how to write in this country's language. Azalea notices Kenichi's strange clothing, so she asks if he's some kind of foreign ambassador, but Kenichi tells her that he's just in town because he wants to start up his own business. Azalea is supportive, but she doesn't think Kenichi will be accepted by the merchant guild since they require their members to be able to read, write, and do math, and he apparently can't. Kenichi is perfectly literate, but he just doesn't understand the language of this country, and as for math, he's pretty good at it, so that shouldn't be a problem. Azalea doesn't believe Kenichi really knows how to do math, so she asks him a basic multiplication problem to test him, and Kenichi answers instantly, basically making him a math genius in this world. Moving on, Azalea helps him write his name down on the contract, and since Kenichi needs to learn to read and write, he asks her if she would be willing to teach him this country's language. He offers to give her some candy in exchange for the language lessons, and as she hears candy, she's totally on board. It's basically impossible to get sweets in the kingdom of Cadon since only nobles ever get to buy things like this. In fact, if the nobles found out that she has such wonderful sweets, they would probably try to take them away from her, but she refuses to let that happen. After Azalea calms down from her sugar rush, she begins teaching Kenichi about this world's language, and it's pretty easy for him to understand since it's similar to the katakana of Japanese. The numbers also follow the same decimal system, so it's not long before Kenichi is able to read and write perfectly. Azalea is amazed that he was able to learn the language in just a few hours, and if he can do that, then he's definitely smart enough to make a good name for himself as a merchant. So she's starting to consider him as a good marriage partner. Kenichi thinks Azalea is joking since he is old enough to be her father, so he doesn't take her statement seriously. He finishes the portraits he had been drawing of her, and when Azalea sees it, she is overjoyed because it looks exactly like her, and normally only nobles get to have their portrait taken. Kenichi has given her delicious candy and drawn a portrait for her, so she can't let him go without giving him something in return, which is why she jumps on top of him, and that night, Kenichi makes it clap. The next morning, Kenichi arrives at the Merchant Guild and meets with one of the representatives because he wants to register with them. The representative gives him some paperwork to fill out, and once he's done with that, all he has to do is pay the registration fee, and he will officially be a member of the Merchant Guild. The registration fee is 1 silver, but that's like 50,000 yen, so he can't afford to pay it all at once and asks to pay it in installments instead. Thankfully, the guild allows partial payments, so Kenichi is now an official member of the Merchants Guild. The receptionist hands him an ID stick and tells him to have it visible whenever he is conducting business because it serves as proof that he is part of the Merchant Guild. Now that he has registered, Kenichi decides to take a walk around the market to figure out how much things cost around here, and overall, all manufactured goods are way more expensive than they would be if he bought them from his store. The only things that are reasonably priced are foods, so while Kenichi is there, he buys a bag of fruit from a vendor. The next day, Kenichi is working on creating a stand so he can sell his goods out in town, and Azalea is impressed by how easy it was for him to make it. While Kenichi is putting up a couple of flyers, Azalea notices that he's using clothespins, and she's really interested in these since their design is really cool. The clothespins that exist in this world are made of wood and a rubber band, but they break so easily that they are practically useless. She asks Kenichi if he's selling these as well, but Kenichi hadn't even considered the fact that something as simple as clothespins could be so valuable. Later that day, Kenichi heads out into the market for his first day as a merchant and finds a good spot next to an old lady. He asks her if she's fine with him setting up his stall here, and she has no problem with it, so Kenichi pulls his stall out of his item box. Anama is impressed by Kenichi's selection of goods, so she looks around for a bit and spots the clothespin he is selling. She really likes them, so she offers to buy a couple, and Kenichi is surprised since he didn't think she would want to support her competition. Anama points out that there's no rule saying she can't buy from him, and besides, she doesn't plan on having some sort of rivalry with him anyway. As the day goes on, Kenichi's stall begins attracting customers, so his goods are being sold fast. Specifically, the clothespins have become quite popular for their reliability, so Kenichi could probably make a living off selling those alone. However, he knows other people will eventually create similar clothespins, so he can't rely on them forever. Just then, a man comes over to Kenichi's stall, and from the fact that he has a sword on his hip and really nice clothes, Kenichi can tell that the guy must be a noble. The man says he wants to have a look at Kenichi's knife, so Kenichi lets him test it out. After the man is satisfied with the sharpness tests, he asks for the price. Kenichi tells him the knife costs 2 silver, and that's pretty expensive, but the man can understand why since this knife is excellently made. He would love to buy it, but he needs a blade that's slightly longer, so Kenichi checks his shop to see if there's anything bigger available, and eventually, he manages to find a katana. The man absolutely loves the katana, but Kenichi tells him the price is 1 gold coin, and that's really expensive, so the man isn't sure if he should buy it or not. While Kenichi watches the man try to convince himself that the sword is a necessary expense, a cat girl starts sniffing his face and licks him. This is the first time Kenichi has ever seen any beast folk, so he's a little scared at first, but he soon calms down and asks them what they would like to buy. They tell them they want the cloth that he is using to cover his stall, and those originally weren't meant to be sold, but Kenichi is a businessman, so if they want the cloths, then he will sell them the cloth. He tells them one cloth costs 3 copper pieces, but since they want to buy 3, he will give them a discount and only charge 8 copper instead. That's a good deal for them, but the beast folk are really bad at math, so they don't understand what Kenichi said at all and assume he's trying to scam them. The nobleman tells the beast folk that Kenichi is telling them the truth, so they don't need to worry about being scammed. So they take his word for it and buy the cloths. The man also decides to buy the sword since it is incredibly well made, so by the end of the day, Kenichi made a really good profit. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, a maid who bought Kenichi's clothespins shows them to her master Primula. Margaret asks Primula if they can use these in the mansion since they would make her work a lot easier, and Primula thinks that's a good idea, so she tells Margaret to go buy some more tomorrow. Better yet, she wants to sell these clothespins at her own company since this is a goldmine of opportunity, so she runs off to ask her father for permission. That evening, Kenichi is taking a bath by the well, and he really wishes he could have a warm bath, but those haven't been invented yet, so he's going to have to make one himself. He looks through the store to see if there's anything he could use to make the hot bath, and he happens to find a barrel for sale, so he intends to fill it with water and put it over a fire so he can experience a hot bath again. And if his idea works out, then he might be able to make some profit from it. That aside, Kenichi has been benefiting a lot from his online store screen, but he has no idea how it actually works or how the packages even get to him in the first place. To be honest, it's way too good to be true, so Kenichi worries it might steal his soul as compensation at some point, but for now, there's no use worrying about it, so he decides to go to sleep. Meanwhile, out in the forest, there's a little girl named Anemone, and she's currently on the run. The next day, as Kenichi is setting up his store, he decides to update his inventory a little, so he puts some jewelry up for sale. These aren't valuable gems by any means, but they look pretty, so he should be able to make a decent profit off them. Just then, the maid from yesterday, Margaret, shows up and says she is here to buy some more clothespins from Kenichi. He asks her how many she wants to buy, and he's surprised to hear that she wants 100, but she has the money for it, so he finalizes the sale. While he is packing up the pins for her, Margaret notices some of the jewels he set out and asks if they are made of real diamonds. Kenichi tells her the jewels are all made from polished glass, but even so, they look really nice, so Margaret asks him to set one aside so she can come back and buy it later. Business goes on as usual for the rest of the day, but just as Kenichi is about to close up shop for the day, the beast folk from yesterday come back to his shop. They look pretty serious, so Kenichi is worried that they might be here to beat him up, but then Mylan gets up close to his face and tells the others that she definitely smells spices coming from him. The other beast folk begin celebrating and ask Kenichi to sell him some of his spices, but he is hesitant to do so after what he heard about the Spice Syndicate. He has no idea how they operate, or what they'll do to him if they find out that he's selling spices, so he doesn't want to risk it. The beast folk keep begging him to make an exception, but the people in the area tell them that they can't expect a new guy like Kenichi to risk his business for their sake, and the beast folk seem to get the message. Kenichi can't sell them any spices, but it technically won't be breaking any rules if he just shares a meal with them, so he invites the group to come eat with him. But it's going to have to be out in the woods so he doesn't attract any negative attention. The beast folk are really happy to hear this, so later that night, they all meet Kenichi and Anama on the outskirts of town so they can begin cooking. Kenichi is about to begin cooking and Anama asks if she can help, so he tells her to cut some of the veggies for him. However, when Anama takes a look at the veggies, she can't believe how vibrant and juicy they look. Kenichi explains that he got these from a foreign country and he can guarantee that these taste really good. While Kenichi and Anama are working on the veggies, Mylan and the other beast folk are busy in the river trying to catch some fish, and soon enough they manage to get a decent amount. Now that all the ingredients are ready, Kenichi begins prepping the fish with the spices and throws everything in a pot to cook for a while, eventually resulting in a meal that the beast folk absolutely love. They've never tasted anything like this before, so they are really thankful for the meal, but all this good food is making them crave alcohol really bad. Anama tells them to show some restraint since alcohol is really expensive, but Kenichi sees no harm in giving them a little to drink, so he pulls out a bottle of cheap booze and pours them a couple of glasses. But in exchange, he wants them to swear that they'll never tell a soul about the meal he made for them. Anama warns Kenichi that he's being a little too generous, but he doesn't see anything wrong with letting the beast folk enjoy themselves, especially since they seem to be good people. That night, they drink together, bathe together, and eventually fall asleep under the stars, and Miley seems to really like Kenichi now. The next morning, Kenichi returns to the inn and Azalea is a bit upset since he was out all night. Kenichi tries to explain that he was just hanging out with a couple of beast folk outside town, but judging from the cat lady fur on his jacket, she thinks Kenichi did a lot more than just hang out, and she's mad he chose to do it with a cat lady instead of her. Later that day, Kenichi is setting up his shop for another day of business, but as he is doing so, Margaret shows up with Primula to visit Kenichi's shop. Kenichi is distracted by Primula's beauty at first, but then he notices Margaret standing behind her and realizes they must be here to buy that necklace Margaret asked about yesterday. He brings it out and Margaret pays for it before giving it to Primula so she can inspect it, and with how well it is made, she's having a hard time believing that it's not made of real diamonds. She asks him if he has any more of these in stock. So Kenichi buys a bunch more from his store and brings them out to show her. Primula is incredibly impressed by the quality of Kenichi's products, as well as the fact that he has an item box, so she has a request to make of him. She tells him that she is the daughter of the owner of the Mallow Trading Company, and if Kenichi is willing to accompany her, she would like to introduce him to her father. Kenichi likes the idea of meeting with the owner of a major trading company, but he is hesitant to meet any big shots, since it might spell trouble for him. However, Anama tells him that Primula's father is well known around town, and everyone says he's a man of good character, so Kenichi doesn't have to worry about getting into trouble with him. Since that's the case, Kenichi agrees to go with Primula, so she invites him to join her in her carriage so they can go meet her father. Along the way, Primula shows him some clothespin replicas she had made, and although the wood shape was easy enough to copy, the metal clamp was too complex for her craftsman to make. Kenichi can understand why they weren't able to figure it out, because even he doesn't know how the springs are made, but he doesn't know that it's a complicated process. They eventually arrive at Primula's home, and Kenichi is amazed by how huge it is, but compared to the houses nobles around here have, Primula says this is actually pretty small. They head inside, and Kenichi is introduced to Primula's father, Mallow. They both greet each other, and Mallow invites Kenichi to have a seat so they can begin their discussion. Once Kenichi is settled in, he shows Mallow some of the jewelry he has, and Mallow is just as impressed as Primula was. On top of that, Primula tells him that Kenichi possesses an item box, and Mallow finds this interesting because he also has one. His time box is what allowed him to build his trading company to this level in the first place, so if used properly, he thinks Kenichi could become quite successful. Although, right now, Kenichi is just using it to store his supplies. Anyway, the reason Mallow wanted to meet with Kenichi is because he wants to discuss the possibility of Kenichi becoming the official supplier for the Mallow company. Kenichi had expected a proposal like this and assumes Mallow intends to market it in such a way to maximize profits. However, if that's what Mallow is after, Kenichi asks why he didn't just keep buying the items from his store for cheap and resell them later on. Mallow definitely could have done that, but that's a sneaky business tactic, and if Kenichi ever found out they were reselling his goods without permission, he wouldn't be very happy about it. Also, having a direct conversation with Kenichi like this gives Mallow an edge over his competitors who would eventually approach him as well. With that being said, Mallows would like to begin their partnership negotiations and offers to pay Kenichi 50% of the retail price for his goods. Kenichi could haggle for a better deal, but he's honestly okay with this since he's already making a ridiculous amount of profit from his online store, so he accepts Mallow's offer, and the two shake hands on it. He officially signs the supply contract, and the first few items he supplies Mallow with earn him over 1 million yen worth of coins. However, when Primula sees all the beautiful jewels Kenichi has in stock, she falls in love with them and asks her father if she can just buy these ones from Kenichi for herself. Mallow sees no problem with that, so Primula offers to pay him 10 gold coins for them, which is equivalent to 2 million yen. So for the first time since he got here, Kenichi has an 8-figure bank balance. Since he's doing so well for himself, he decides to finally begin setting things up for his quiet life and buys a home from his store. The next day, he leaves the city walls and heads out into the forest to look for a good place to set up his home. Before he left, he told Azalea about his plan so she wouldn't be worried, but she thought it was a bit strange that Kenichi was willingly choosing to live out in the dangerous forest instead of staying in the city. Once he finally finds a good spot, Kenichi purchases a weed whacker and begins landscaping the area, but he runs into a problem since even though other things from his store are pretty cheap, fuel is always expensive no matter what world you live in. There's nothing he can do about it though, so he deals with the high cost and keeps working until he has eventually cleared a path for himself to get in and out of the forest. After that, he needs to start working on getting rid of all these trees, so he buys a chainsaw and starts cutting. After several hours of hard work, Kenichi has finally managed to cut through a bunch of the trees in the area, so all that's left is to move them out of the way. However, when he tries to stuff the trees in his item box, it doesn't work. It looks like the trees are too long to fit, so he's going to have to bust out the chainsaw again and cut them down into more manageable pieces. He eventually shortens the trees into 10-meter logs, and this way he is able to fit them in his item box, so he's almost done with the tree removal. The only thing left to do is pull out all the tree stumps, but that's going to be a lot of work, and the sun is already setting, so he decides to come back and finish up tomorrow. The next day, Kenichi returns to the forest to finish the work, but after digging at the stump for a while, he realizes that this is way too much work for a middle-aged man like him, so rather than destroy his back over this, he decides to just buy a backhoe. However, once he actually sees it, he realizes he just spent 1.2 million yen on heavy machinery because he didn't want to do manual labor, and he's kind of regretting that, but at the same time, this means you won't have to work as hard, so maybe it was a worthwhile investment. He starts up the engine, but then he realizes that this thing runs on diesel, and his store doesn't sell diesel at all. He starts panicking since it would be a huge waste if he couldn't use the backhoe after he spent so much money on it. He thinks for a second and realizes he could probably make his own diesel if he mixes kerosene and some additives, but when he's about to try it out, he realizes he could destroy the backhoe's engine if he gets the proportions of the mixture wrong. So just to be safe, he decides to test out his mixture on a diesel generator first. After filling it up, he tries turning it on, and it seems to work fine, so he knows his homemade diesel will work with the backhoe, so he intends to return tomorrow to finish the job. In the meantime, he needs to do something about all the bugs out here, so the next day, he decides to head to a local magic shop to buy some bug-repellent magic stones. As he enters the shop, the wizard who owns it greets Kenichi and asks him where he's from since he hasn't seen him around here before. Kenichi explains that he's a foreigner who just recently set up a shop in town, and he's here because he wants to buy some bug-repellent stones. The wizard tells him that those stones cost 3 silver coins, but that's really expensive, so Kenichi tries to make a deal and offers to give the wizard 2 oranges if he can lower the price. The wizard has never seen oranges before, so he thinks they must be some kind of exotic fruit and agrees to give Kenichi a discount because of it. Later that day, Kenichi goes to talk to Anama, and she tells him that the wizard is a really knowledgeable guy, so he's a good person to have as a friend. Pretty much the exact opposite of the wanted criminal, Shaga, whose wanted posters have been hung up all across town. He's the leader of a notorious bandit group, so the reward for his capture is pretty big. In fact, that night, Shaga organizes a raid on a carriage full of slaves that were being transported, and who knows what he plans to do with them. The next day, Kenichi heads back into the forest so he can finally use his backhoe, and he no longer regrets his purchase because not only is it making his work a lot easier, but it's also really fun. Now, nothing can stop him from fulfilling his dream of living a quiet life in the woods, but after spending so much money on the backhoe, he's dangerously close to being broke, so he's going to have to put a hold on any further construction progress. This was the end of episode 2. Subscribe to not miss the next part.